Hi folks, welcome to the last third of class. This, I believe, is module 11, although it is very possible that I've reconfigured the order because I always kind of struggle to figure out, because I want to put cross-cultural psych as early as possible, but also not break it up all the bio units, and so it usually ends up as like the lead of the third chunk. We'll also have a lot of Freud after this, as well as some personality processes, and we'll conclude with personality and health, both mental and physical. So let's get started. Let's try this. There we go. Okay. So, big objectives for this unit are going to be discuss the implications of cultural diversity for personality psychology, discuss what cross-cultural psychology is and what culture is. We're going to also discuss characteristics of culture and why differences are important. We'll also discuss how to assess culture, and we will kind of conclude with possible origins of cultural differences. And yeah, that's where we're going to go. I'm going to try and break this stuff up as much as possible. You're also, just a heads up, there's going to be lots of quirky anecdotes about my Eastern European family, because I really prefer, when I talk about cultural difference, to talk from my own experience rather than extrapolate from what I've read in the literature, because a lot of this work does a lot with East Asian versus Western culture, and it's not as cut and dry as that, because if it were, we wouldn't have this unit. We would have more statistics that I would kind of pretend are personality. But no, obviously this is a big important unit. The reason why I'm going to talk about it from my own background experiences as someone who is bicultural is to just give you a sense that it's not as cut and dry, and also to not kind of claim other people's stories and just share mine, because I'm got a pretty good handle on my own experiences, but I know that my experiences are unique to me and my very quirky family. But that's kind of the logic of sharing lots of grandmother anecdotes. It's the same grandma who we heard about from her throughout this class. It's the same one. And she is watching these videos, so far she liked them. We'll find out if she continues to. I know that anecdotes feel a little weird, but I think they add some color that you can't really get from the book. And not all of us have, well, not all of us have my grandma. Alright. So I'm going to start by asking kind of some think about it questions that might be helpful for you as just like a prompt, both for our kind of engagement activities, or just kind of getting you thinking about this. So, have you ever lived in a different culture or known someone from a different culture? Do people from that culture view things differently? And how fundamental are those differences? Are they minor? So I did a semester abroad in graduate school in Canada. Technically, it was a different culture, but not really. I mean, the biggest culture shocks were people had multiple recycling bins. People were really nice. Cost of living in theory was really high. Lots, in just slightly different values on things. And, they have a queen, which was kind of cool. I wish, in some way, I was about to say I wish we had a queen. But, depends on, be interesting, for sure. But, that's where we're those are kind of the big questions I want to ask and think about, because culture flavors is not the right word. Culture is the lens through which we see everything. And those differences can lead to huge misunderstandings if you assume that, whoever you're interacting with sees everything through that exact same lens as you. Just so from a, why is this relevant to me as a, Wake Forest undergrad? I mean, usually what I say is look around you. Everyone's experiences are different. Some of them are kind of more stereotypically visible. Others are not. You would never know that I'm bicultural just from looking at me. Or that, I definitely lean more heavily into the collectivist culture than individualistic, even though my family are descended from pilgrims. But I'm also descended from refugees. You would never know unless I told you, like I just did right now. And that, I'm part, how do I phrase this in a way that is not I look super white, but in fact, I'm a part Romani gypsy. You would never know unless I told you. And so don't assume that people's cultural backgrounds are identical to yours. Or, and you'll learn a lot. And get to see new perspectives if you needed that sales pitch. Most folks I don't think need that sales pitch, but there it is if you want it. Okay, so what is cross-cultural psych? So what it is a research and theorizing that attempt to account for. One second, I want to scroll up because there we go. No. Sorry, I repositioned my camera recently, so I'm still trying to figure out the best spot to make sure I grab my whole script, and I have not found that best spot. Okay, so it's an attempt to account for psychological differences between and within cultural groups. So, classic examples of this is materialism. So Americans are known for being more materialistic than other cultures and groups, but they also differ in how materialistic they are amongst themselves. So they're both between group differences and within group differences. Not everybody who's an American is the exact same level of materialism or not. So that's one go-to illustrative example. So, but this is a personality class. This is not a cross-cultural class. So why am I talking about it? Because it colors everything. Culture intersects with personality. So individuals can differ from each other to some extent because they belong to different cultures. So if there was an identical twin version of me and she was adopted out, depending on where I was adopted out, say I was adopted out to a normal white bread family, I would be I would not have the bicultural things I do. I wouldn't have been raised with it. So part of that, and I imagine that would impact different aspects of my personality. For example, probably if I was raised more individualistic, I would be more prone to anger. It takes a lot to make me mad, for example, which is one kind of cool quirk of biculturalism. Or not bicultural, of collectivism. Now, what can make me really angry is if my kin are threatened. So if you threaten a sister, you are in for a world of hurt. But thankfully, nobody does that. But other things that I'm struggling to come up with good examples because I don't get angry. I get frustrated, but never angry. So imagine the last time you were angry. It is very unlikely that same situation would make me angry unless a family member was involved. I apologize that I'm struggling to come up with an example, but the fact that I'm struggling to come up with an example kind of indicates that even though I have higher than average levels of neuroticism, it just doesn't get expressed in classic ways because of my kind of culture aspects. So, But the point that I'm trying to get at is, so while individuals may differ from each other to some extent because they belong to different cultures, different members of any individual cultural group, so while they will differ from individuals, they will also differ kind of like more broadly from different groups. And these differences are important and they vary across culture. Like, I've also found it very helpful to explain to people why family is important to me by using this cultural lens, because even to an extent that most people don't realize, like I took this position because it's close to family. And so for some people that may be like, it's a nice bonus. No, it was like a really important aspect to me. There are cross-cultural universals versus kind of specificity. So there is evidence that for both. So the traditional emphasis in cross-cultural research has been on specificity, or how people in different cultures differ from each other. So comparing across different cultures. But more recent research, and actually what a lot of personality psychology tries to encourage, is focus on universals. So what do we have in common across all our cultural groups? What do people have in common? Compared to like people from one group versus people from another. It's focusing on commonalities versus differences. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let me define what culture is. So culture is a collection of psychological attributes of groups. And these include customs, habits, beliefs, and values that shape emotion, behavior, and life patterns. These can include both language and modes of thinking, as well as fundamental views of reality, like just having a totally different value system. All right, so we've got a couple more terms. So acculturation is the process of socialization through which an individual acquires their native culture. This tends to occur early in life. And so with my example of identical twin being raised apart, you could reunite us, pretty early, by 10, and we would still have that cultural difference. Now, I imagine that if I were raised only amongst travelers, I would have a much more collectivist culture, like as a proportion. But because I've got a mixture, it's probably why I'm bicultural. Just that mix of having early exposure to both. And this occurs early in life. So acculturation is the process of partially or fully acquiring a new cultural outlook later in life. So kind of whether you're born with it or maybe it's acculturation, Maybelline? Sorry, that was a really terrible joke. It's about Maybelline eye stuff. But so you can acquire culture later, but I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. But typically the bigger cultural influences, and so there's you can be primed to kind of think about different aspects, and if you can but acculturation is later in life. Enculturation, so the EN one is early and the acculturation is after. Early versus after might at least help you. Now, this is due to way more than genetics, obviously. And as a behavior geneticist, that may surprise you to tell when I say that these cultural differences mostly are the product of the environment. There might be some minor things, and we'll talk about those later in the section, but from adoption studies, and even if you were to look at my genetic makeup, and this is actually a thing among Romani, people of Romani descent, is at this point most of us don't have a large chunk of Indian DNA like the original kind of folks when they came over from India 1,200 years ago, or about 800 years ago. And so while I have a decent chunk of Indian DNA, you would never know it from looking at me, and there are many Romani Gypsy who do not have any Indian DNA. at all. Even though you would never know the difference just from various, it's the environment. It's how you were raised. It's not genes. I mean, sure, there might be a bit, but not a lot. All right. So here's why it's important I mean, I kind of already gave you this pitch, but the importance of cross-cultural differences, please don't let me understate this. These differences in attitudes, values, and behavioral styles can cause huge misunderstandings. So behaviors that are common in one culture can be interpreted really negatively in others. For example, spray painting cars in Singapore is apparently a common thing. I have not experienced this. Leaving a sleeping baby outside in Denmark. And if you actually look at Call the Midwife, it's pretty common to just leave your baby outside. Yeah, like you're pretty much never allowed to leave a baby alone in the United States. But yeah. I mean, and there are other ones like, for me, like family, big important one. And so while in some cultures, for example, like asking the father for permission to like for their blessing to get married seems to be a pretty classic American thing. But if my partner did that, oh, that would be bad. Instead, they need to ask my grandmother. So that's my fun, weird anecdote. Now, you wouldn't have to give my grandmother goats, but the running joke in my family is definitely like, how many, I don't know, I'm trying to, it's how many goats. We don't have goats, but like, it's just a silly joke now. But apparently it was a thing once. But that's more of like picking up after the fact. That's not like a cultural, that's not like a historic thing. I think that's just a weird inside joke my family has. Like a super weird one. But anyway, let's keep going. So, generalizability of theory and research. Obviously, like this is a huge, I know I'm going to keep saying obviously, but it is pretty important here. So, cultural differences really impair our ability to make broad claims. So assessing the degree of generalizability across cultures is just an issue. And even how you categorize, like even like within a study, like our psych subject pool probably has a decent, because we're I think 8% international students. And let's just pretend for 1 second that every international student has a collectivist culture. And every domestic student has an individualistic culture. Let's just pretend. That means 8% of our sample, we don't know, like, if we overgeneralize and say, 100% of the sample is individualistic because they're in the United States, that's a problem. And so even within samples, that can be an issue. But to give you a sense of how prevalent of a problem this is, so most research is based on countries that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Weird. But they only represent 12% of the world's population. Would anyone like to take a guess of what percentage of psychology research uses weird subjects, and how this is counted is a little debatable, because like what it tends to do is they look at the institution that the person is at and declare that. But any guesses? Bueller? 80%. So 12% of the population, but 80% of psychology research participants. Yeah. It's a huge mismatch. And it misses out, and like we already have talked about how this can be problematic, because even within weird samples, we don't even have a representative weird samples. We've got so there are just extra layers of generalizability issues here. And there's also like hidden non-weirdness, like, because I would get classified as individualistic unless they actually like ask me what my like culture is in surveys and things. They'll just assume. And so there are lots of layers of problems here, lots of assumptions. And those assumptions can be really problematic. But, yeah. And they can miss out on wide varieties of human experience. Like, actually, a lot of... So, yeah. So, there's a ton of evidence that culture affects the ways personality is expressed. And also how emotion is experienced. For example, my, not getting angry, would make different emotion labs really challenging. And, labs coming out of, individualistic labs, or, with individualistic subjects versus collectivist subjects, can have major differences. So, yeah, so this is especially prevalent in, how personality is expressed and how emotion is experienced. So it's very likely that when I feel anger, in the very rare case that feeling might be very different than the feeling you feel when you experience anger. I don't know, because I'm me. Those are my experiences are limited. And so it's hard to know, how universal that is. Obviously, there's research on this, but it's a cultural difference. And so these cultures kind of influence the construals of the world. Culture is a lens through which we see everything. Okay. So, usually, in class, I will show a couple of clips from My Big Fat Greek Wedding. It's also a lovely childhood movie of mine that I really spoke to me as a kid. So even though it's about Greek culture, that it's pretty good. It spoke to me. And just highlighting those differences and differences in expectations, and just interactions, it is just rife for comedy, for sure. And so I've got some links here. I encourage you, and you are welcome to count this as an engagement activity. If you watch My Big Fat Greek Wedding, you can count it. You just have to say, I watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which you said in the video counts as an engagement activity. Yeah, do it. I've included some links, but I don't know how well they'll show up because this film is copyrighted. And so although this would be fair use to show you these 2 clips, it's a little harder to do online. So yeah. Alright, so next time we are going to talk about characteristics of cultures. I kind of hinted at it, saying individualistic versus collectivist, stuff like that, and giving you some broad terms. But we're going to actually talk about those specific terms and give you some definitions and examples and whatnot. Thanks for watching. I will see y'all later. Bye-bye.